Welcome in. I'm Collette Wieland alongside Dr. Stephen Camarata. Steve is recognized for his child development work, especially when it comes to speech and language. Last week, we talked about common labels that children are given, and those labels usually come at a young age. And over the next several episodes, we will talk about some of those common labels and what those families can expect with each label. Today, our topic is autism. A lot of children receive an autism label. You have spouted off in the past. What's the percentage look like these days of diagnosis?
So actually recently it came out, and it's now gotten to the point where it's 1 in 35. As we go on our label journey, though, I do want to make something really clear, which is that your late talker is not a label. So we're going to talk about labels in the sense of informing how we support development, how we empower families to optimize their child's learning. But it's really important that we have kind of a frame for how to help a child, but your child's not a label. And so I'm going to talk about this stuff, but I'm going to continually return to that this is, your child and not a label. And it's important to always bear that in mind. And that's certainly true with autism.
And what you're saying, too, with late talker's not a label itself. Late talker is either a symptom of something else or just a stage they pass through, and a stage doesn't deserve a label.
Correct, yeah. A late talker, when the late talking is a stage, is just a variation on typical development.
Perfect. So back to autism.
Yes, right. Bring me back.
Yeah, if your child is given an autism label, what are some of the first things that parents need to do or should do?
So one of the real challenges right now is, for example, if you Google late talker, you're going to be immediately put into a questionnaire on autism. You may get linked to the CDC website on signs of autism. Even if you go, the CDC website actually has information on language disorder and other kinds of things, but you're really, any late talking child is pushed into autism. And so it's important to educate yourself about it. And what I want to suggest people do is that they really think about classic autism. It may be worth watching the movie Rain Man and seeing that wonderful performance that Dustin Hoffman did of an adult, high-functioning autistic person.
High functioning with still under classic, still under the classic late.
Yeah. Okay. So Dustin Hoffman actually just did a marvelous job of studying autistic behavior and then emulating, and he's a terrific actor. And so he received an Academy Award for that performance. So he was actually playing someone with high functioning autism as an adult. And I'm just saying that because now the autism spectrum has become so broad that parents can really get lost and confused. And I'll give you a good vignette. So one time I was working with a family whose child had classic autism. He was very low verbal, had behavior challenges. Any kind of deviation routines resulted in just really meltdowns. And they were in the waiting room at the clinic. And this other family, it was two moms, and the mom of the child with classic autism, that kid had a meltdown in the waiting room, and she's trying to use the strategies we taught her to manage it. And this other mom said, my child has autism, and I just like reason with him. I just talk to him and give him self-calming strategies that he can say to himself, to calm himself. And I'm like, this mom's experience and this mom's experience are completely different, because talking to her son, the one who has classic autism, would actually result in talking in long sentences like that would cause him to actually have more meltdowns. And so the fact that we're putting those two people in the same bin makes it very difficult for parents to navigate that system. And we now have a lot of adults who are going online and taking quizzes, and then are self-identifying as autistic, and their experience is very different than a child who's nonverbal, who's really been through a different journey. And certainly parents want to be really clear that, kind of where their child is on the spectrum if they get put on the spectrum. And so it's just a very amorphous, very non-precise label at this point. In fact, when someone emails me or says my child has autism, I have no idea what's going to walk in the door. It might be someone whose late talking is simply a stage. It might be someone with a speech disorder. It might be someone with intellectual disability. It might be somebody with classic autism. It might be somebody who's just mildly socially quirky. And that's how imprecise the label has gotten at this point.
So you should not seek an label from the internet, is what you're saying. What you need to do is go speak to a professional, and just to kind of reiterate, who is that? Who can give your child either an autism diagnosis or not autism diagnosis?
So I'm really glad you talked about yes or no. It's important to do a differential diagnosis. Again, in my world, if we're dealing with a toddler, preschool, early school age child, we want to use our classic criteria. Make sure they have the full description. The way an autism diagnostic process is supposed to go is you're supposed to decide whether they meet the criteria, which are reduced motivation for social interaction. Of course, late talking is part of it, although not always. And then there also has to be a very noticeable disruptive adherence to routines. So that routine preferring and that reduced motivation for social interaction are the two keys. And the reduced motivation for social interaction should also be nonverbal. In other words, when I'm working with a child with autism and I'm like attempting to play with them, they'll take their things and just turn away. They are resisting social overtures in that situation. Now, you also asked who, and that's a big question. So the usual course for an assessment, what will happen is in the well baby check with a pediatrician, child hits 16, 18 months, they're not talking, that pediatrician is going to say, okay, your child's not talking, or their talking development is delayed. I'm going to refer you to somebody who's going to do an assessment. Now, it could be through early intervention, which might be a speech pathologist. They might refer you to a physician who has special training called a developmental pediatrician. There's different places you might go, and that also presents its own challenges. And so you get on a journey there. And in a way, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's a child psychiatrist, a child psychologist, developmental pediatrician, speech pathologist. The diagnostic process should be similar for differential diagnosis, and that's important. Another thing I'm going to say is that it's really, you really need to spend time with the child and see them in different environments to be really confident in your diagnosis. I recall one case where the little guy had a pretty severe language disorder, and went to the assessment and was really upset and distraught. And he was kind of staggering to his father to get away from the assessor. He had an adverse reaction to the assessor, and so he was kind of stumbling when he did that. And so then in the report I got back, it was like motor disorder. And this little kid was like the most awesome soccer player I've ever seen. He was the opposite of a motor disorder. So context of assessment matters. And I'm using kind of an extreme example, but if you bring a child to like a medical center and there are people with white coats and you get in this elevator, it's like a medical center where the kids have gotten shots, that might really kind of change the assessment. And then also, you bring in somebody new. I'm kind of grandpa looking, and so the kids generally take to me pretty well. But and of course, I'm very attuned to children with all different kinds of developmental levels. But if somebody's in there, they're testing them. You may not necessarily get the best view of it. So my long story short is you want to make sure someone is taking the appropriate time to get to know your child before they actually provide a diagnosis of autism. I've
How
had
many
parents.
times should they be seeing this?
Well, normally, part of it's limited by the way that services are delivered. So I would always recommend that you meet somebody and you talk to them ahead of time. And I always get a video from home before I even see the family. I want to see what that child looks like in a kind of a typical kind of casual thing. And with cell phones and things,
It's easier.
you can do that really easy,
Yeah.
and it's easy to airdrop stuff, and and so I really recommend that you reach out to a clinician who's going to do their due diligence. I have had parents report to me, hey, I went to a clinic, my child was upset. The person said 15 minutes with me, they filled out a checklist, and then they gave me an autism spectrum label, and that's not really what it should be. The other thing is still true today. We have more and more sophisticated autism tests. But to this day, the gold standard is what we call clinical impression. And the thing about autism is that, especially in classic autism, the way the person acts is very noticeable. And so clinical impression, that is getting to know the child and then making your determination that way, is still the gold standard for how you diagnose autism. And so you do that, you see the child, you might give them whatever test. Certainly some children you can't really test, they're not ready for that. So you're doing observations and you're going through a series of little presses with toys and different social things. We have a structured way of doing that. But then you make your determination, and then the clinician is supposed to then give it a rating of, how severe. So mild means relatively low support, moderate, and then of course high support would be your classic autism, where you have to just really provide a lot of support for the child to be social, participate, learn to talk, and that kind of thing. So when you walk away from it, you should say, the clinician should be able to explain to you why they diagnosed the autism, what the features were that they saw. They should answer every single question a parent has because in a positive, non-threatening way. And they should say, this is mild, moderate, severe. This is grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, so that you have a sense of what they're seeing and what it is. And if you don't agree with it, by all means, get a second opinion. And again, there is this kind of establishment, process where a lot of kids are just being kind of made eligible for autism services for financial reasons. They're not really doing a differential diagnosis. So you definitely want to say, hey, you say my child has autism, why? And did you differentiate it from intellectual disability? How did you differentiate it from social communication disorder? How did you differentiate it from language disorder? Ask those questions, and they should be able to answer it. Why?
Do you usually get a typed out report with that?
Yeah. So what's going to happen is normally you have a visit, and then what'll happen is that within a week or two, then you'll get a report. If you disagree with the report, feel free to reach out and say, hey, this isn't what I understood or whatever it is. I mean, you just want to make sure this is a very serious fork in the road for your child, your late talker. So you want to make sure that you're really on board with everything that's happening and then it's very accurate.
You just talked about a child getting kind of a level 1, level 2, level 3.
Yes.
Is that the spectrum? I guess, I don't know. I just envision this rainbow of diagnosis. So
I'll try. I'm a professor, so we tend to talk too much. We get paid to talk.
Let's rein it in.
Yeah,
right
so I'll rein it in if I can. My mom always said that even though I didn't speak at all until I was 3.5, I spent the rest of my life making up for it. Right? Yeah. But anyway, all that aside, so what happened was when it was first discovered, it was called autistic disorder, and it was fairly specific and fairly narrow. And then it kind of was a specialty or niche kind of diagnosis. And then in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it really got more codified, and it actually got into that DSM. And then in the late 80s, it was, then very more codified. That's the late 80s is really where the criteria were laid out in a very systematic way. They were systematic before, but then it became part of that manual that people use. And then in the 1990s, there was a big revision that kind of broadened the features that would be in it. And then in the 2013 revision, it just is called autism spectrum disorder. So the spectrum has evolved, has become broader and broader and broader. And ironically, the main person who discovered it and talked about it, a professor a physician at Johns Hopkins named Leo Kanner, he really was upset about this calling everything under the sun autism. And he was saying that in the 1960s and 70s before it exploded. I can only imagine if you were alive what he would be saying today, because he really did see it as a specific collection of features that prompted the original paper that he wrote in the early 1940s, which kind of described autism as we know it.
So is there a benefit to getting a autism spectrum label for your child versus a classic autism label, or no label at all?
So in the 1994 version, you actually had to decide that. You had to say it was autistic disorder, which was the classic, or you would say the other ones back then were, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. There were other bins you could put them in. But in the 2013 revision, it's the label is autism spectrum disorder. So we don't really have that in our toolkit anymore. So what I do is I say autism spectrum disorder, and I say level 3 for classic autism. And then I say that, this meets the description of classic autism. I use the words classic autism in my report so that I can alert others and families that I'm talking about a child who really is going to have high support needs going forward. And very remarkable is the wrong word, very noticeable differences in learning and how we have to approach them. And we have to be really good detectives to support their learning.
What does that learning look like, that development for a child with autism?
Yeah, so the main feature about autism, when it's that it has that reduced motivation for social communication part or social interaction part. So we have to be really thoughtful and mindful about how we're going to motivate and reward this child to be social, because that's kind of the foundation for how we're going to teach. And it turns out that if we can kind of increase the socialization, then things that we use to teach, techniques we use to teach other kinds of late talkers are very effective, but they're ineffective unless we can figure out that motivational piece and find the detective work of how can we, incentivize that child to be social. Now, humans in general, and most late talkers, are social. They're motivated to be social. They want to be around people. They want to interact. They want to gain attention. And these are some of the markers we use to differentiate autism from other kinds of late talkers. And so the key thing is we have to do the detective work to figure out how to motivate them to communicate. Now, this can be, in most severe cases, it can be traditional kinds of reward systems where we might, prompt the child gently, not in a forceful way, and then give them a reward, like a food reward. In some cases, we have to use that. Thankfully, not very often. Most children don't require that. Two of my colleagues, Robert and Lynn Cagle, have developed a rubric called, or a treatment approach called pivotal response training or pivotal response teaching. And that one actually harnesses and does the detective work, what we call natural reinforcers or natural rewards. So you can observe the child. Oh, here's a case. There's a, let's say they're motivated to use an iPad and they want that. Well, now you can use that as a natural reward to induce them to communicate in other situations where they don't want to be social. So you do the detective work to figure out, how to motivate them and support it. And once you do that, then a lot of good things are going to happen. But you have to do that. Now, the caveat is that if you come in with external motivation like food rewards, that totally derails normal development. And so it's something that you only want to use judiciously, and it's only in those cases where you have to do it. Because otherwise, you're really teaching that child to look at the hands for the reward. I actually wrote about this back in about 2000. I did a review of these reward-based interventions and how they really are different from normal social development and how there's a cost for that. So people might say, oh, you can get 40 hours of, this kind of, autism treatment and it's paid for and so on, but it's actually something that could really change the developmental course. And if your child who's late talking is a stage and not a symptom, or it's a symptom of something else, it can actually have a harmful effect. So you really want to be a good consumer of the treatment that you're getting.
And there's no one size fits all for every child who is given an autistic label. No,
in fact, these program kinds of things where everybody gets the same treatment absolutely is not appropriate. So autism, so I said they have a low motivation for social interaction, but what actually serves as motivators for them is highly individualized. That's why the pivotal response training is effective, because the entry into that is doing the upfront detective work to figure out what motivates them. So you can't do a one-size-fits-all because you have to do the hard work of figuring out what motivates the child and where those windows of interaction are so you can harness them for learning. So with autism, you could say, well, the motivation to be social is much lower, much narrower, but it does exist. And so you have to find where that is and then deliver the services within that. And so a one-size-fits-all absolutely won't work. And then many children with autism, for example, when you try to prompt them, so you might sit them down and say, okay, say book, say pen, they may actually have a meltdown when you do that. And so one of my favorite studies that we did, it appeared in the Journal of Positive Behavior Intervention, we showed that children who don't imitate well in baseline don't do well in imitation-based treatments. It's like, okay, that seems really logical. But a lot of times when a child gets an autism label, the first thing they do is sit them down in a chair and they force them to imitate. And so, again, we have that in our toolkit. We have to use it sometimes, but and even the guy who could develop this, Ivar Lovaas, in his initial study, the children that responded to that were children who imitated in pretest and were, you could prompt them and they would imitate you. And so that's kind of a screener for what kind of treatment you want to do. And that's just one example. So you might have a child with severe autism, but one might be amenable to imitating. Another, it may be the very worst thing you can do. So you have to do the individual detective work. It's crucial, especially in autism.
What kind of early intervention is there? And two-part question. And is it necessary?
So early intervention, I'm sorry, it sounds like I'm self-serving here with the writing. We wrote an article back in 2014 talking about early intervention is positive and effective if the differential diagnosis is accurate and the developmental supports you put on are effective. So early intervention could be good, it could be bad, or it could have no effect depending on if it's done properly. And so there's just this general idea, well, I need to get my child in and get services. Well, it depends on the kind of services.
Has to be the right service.
Has to be the right service. And so that's why differential diagnosis, proper label, and then doing the detective work to find out how to optimize the child's learning is absolutely foundational. In those situations, early intervention is very helpful, and we want to do it. If you have the wrong label and you're getting the wrong treatment, it actually is going to make the situation worse.
Set you back.
It'll set you back because, I have situations where I have children that come in and before they were in treatment, they were fairly easy to work with. And then because someone did a prompt-based treatment or somebody put them in a timeout room to the point they were traumatized, by the way, I'd never recommend using a timeout room. They were strapped in a chair or things like this. Their behavior now is much more difficult. So my job got a lot harder. There were extra things I had to deal with that the wrong kind of treatment actually induced. Now, thankfully, that's not common, but unfortunately, it does happen.
Is there anything else you'd like parents to know about an autism label?
Yeah, so it's kind of what I started off with, which is your child's not the label. And, children with autism have a very different learning style. They're very interesting, and I love, kind of following their play leads and things like that. So I have parents that really themselves get really traumatized when they get an autism label. And I certainly have parents that I say, hey, I believe your child has autism, and they really fight me on it. And please fight with me. I don't have a problem with that. I know that, you deserve answers from me, and I'm going to give them to you as best I can. But the key is to get to know your child. The other really important key that Mary talks about a lot in her travel notes, check the travel notes. She's awesome, and I'm biased. You know more about your child than anybody else. And so if something about what someone's saying about your child doesn't ring true, don't be afraid to talk to them about it. And, you don't necessarily need to be confrontational, but it's like, you know what? You're saying my child does X, and you know what? My child doesn't do X at home, or my child really isn't like that. And you're the expert on your child. The parent is the expert on the child. And with autism, that's totally true because the parents are doing all the caregiving. They're in those day-to-day kinds of things, and they know their child in a way no clinician ever could. So it's important to keep that in mind.
Next week, Steve, we're going to talk about another label children often received, and that is a language disorder. So be sure to join us right back here for that next week. In the meantime, please drop your questions below in the comment section. Click subscribe so we can keep getting this valuable information your way. Hit that bell. And of course, you can always check out the Late Talkers Foundation website.
And remember, the best thing for your child is you.